Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're throwing on our labor historian hats and digging straight into the archives of workplace hierarchy to explore a really fascinating historical theory. We're looking at the surprising continuum between the feudal masters of the past and today's mid-level corporate supervisors. You see, the sources we're exploring today argue that the history of capitalism isn't just a simple story of owners and workers. Actually, there's this massive hidden layer right in the middle that actually runs the machine. So let's kick things off with a pretty provocative question to frame our historical investigation here. What are the true, hidden origins of the person evaluating your performance at work? When you sit down for a performance review, or when your daily tasks are monitored by time-tracking software, where does that structure of authority actually originate? We usually just assume that modern management was born purely out of a need for operational efficiency or new technology, but the historical analysis we are looking at today tells a completely different story. To wrap our heads around this, the source material defines the managerial class in a highly specific way. Rather than viewing them as some modern invention of corporate efficiency, the analysis presents them as a historical class of salaried enforcers, literally designed to translate the will of capital into daily domination. The core argument here is that capital itself doesn't actually discipline workers. Managers do. Corporations don't fire people. Managers do. According to this view, they are capitalism's indispensable intermediaries. They don't own the means of production, but they administer it. They are essentially rulers without crowns. If we trace this evolutionary timeline, the analysis maps out how the absolute DNA of workplace hierarchy mutated over centuries. We can follow a direct, undeniable line from the stewards and bailiffs managing feudal estates for absentee aristocrats back in the 1400s, straight to the colonial administrators of the 1600s, think of the clerks in the British East India Company. The text argues that this lineage then flows directly into the plantation overseers of the 1800s, the industrial foremen of the 1900s, right up to the open plan offices of Silicon Valley today. The basic premise? Long before there was administration, there was command. Now, according to the historical record, when society shifted from feudalism to early capitalism, that personal domination didn't just magically disappear. The sources argue it was simply legally re-articulated. The English Master and Servant Act seamlessly transformed the highly visible personal coercion of the feudal lord into the supposedly neutral legal abstraction of the modern employment contract, where a lord ruled by literal force, the capitalist employer ruled by contract. Workers were technically free, sure, but the text points out that this freedom existed in a framework where a breach of contract by a worker was a criminal offense, while an employer's breach was merely a civil dispute. The analysis suggests the law basically preserved coercion, just hiding it under the guise of an agreement. Section 1. Capitalism's first true manager. Looking closely at the text, a really striking structural parallel jumps right out at us. The sources argue that the modern manager inherited a very similar operational mandate to the early plantation overseer. Think about it. The overseer didn't own the enterprise, but they wielded near absolute authority to maximize output, tracking productivity with meticulous ledgers, and enforcing routines with patrols and physical discipline. The theory suggests today's corporate supervisor performs an identical structural function, extracting labor on behalf of absentee owners, simply by stripping away the physical violence and sanitizing it into bureaucratic performance metrics, HR sanctions, and algorithmic tracking. As labor historians like Edward Daptis point out, the overseer is this absolutely critical transition point between feudal domination and capitalist administration. The text argues they were tasked not just with basic control, but with ruthless bottom-line optimization. The plantation, according to this research, was not some pre-modern relic. Not at all. It was a highly organized proto-industrial regime. The meticulous timing of work and the drive to constantly increase output quotas actually pioneered techniques that the sources say would eventually be exported up to northern factories, laying the very groundwork for modern management. Section 2. The Industrial Viceroy. Now that number right there, 300, that represents a pretty chilling historical reality detailed in the texts. At the absolute height of America's Gilded Age, Andrew Carnegie desperately wanted to crush a labor union at his massive steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania. But, he didn't want the public relations nightmare of literal blood on his hands. So, what did he do? He turned to his superintendent, Henry Clay Frick. In 1892, Frick hired exactly 300 private Pinkerton mercenaries, armed them with Winchester rifles, and used them to brutally break the Homestead strike, all while Carnegie was safely sailing the coast of Scotland. The analysis points to Frick as the ultimate historical archetype of the managerial enforcer. He was the hand that executed the brutal commands an absentee owner like Andrew Carnegie could not publicly admit to doing. He acted as a viceroy, someone who absolutely does not own the kingdom, but governs it with absolute delegated authority. For these historians, Frick reveals that capitalism's most brutal commands are almost never carried out by owners themselves. Instead, they completely rely on intermediaries who are willing to enforce that daily domination.
Section 3. Capital's internal police force.
Notice how the tools of coercion really evolved over time. The sources outline this massive shift in control, moving from the blaring factory whistle that regimented time to quotas that disciplined pace, all the way down to today's invisible, totally seamless algorithmic tracking software. The text argues this evolution allows managers to enforce strict corporate discipline without the overt spectacle of violence. In this view, the constant threat of dismissal or the loss of your livelihood acts as a permanent disciplinary pressure. It effectively embeds an internal police force right onto the factory floor or, right into your laptop software.
The sources point to Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management, what we often just call Taylorism, as the true intellectual blueprint for this internal police force. Taylor essentially armed supervisors with stopwatches and clipboards to break human labor down into its absolute smallest micro-movements. The theory explains that under this system, workers were no longer seen as individuals with any sort of discretion, but simply as controllable units of energy. The core role of the manager became translating totally abstract corporate imperatives, like annual profit targets, into a lived daily routine on the ground.
So today's mid-level managers? The text described them as the custodians of these now automated Taylorist systems. The text breaks this down into a really clear four-step procedure by generating metrics, monitoring daily compliance, documenting any data deviations, and then enforcing HR sanctions. Middle management fully sanitizes this control. The historians argue that they turn the extraction of labor into a supposedly neutral administrative procedure. Because of this, workers experience it not as tyranny, but just as standard, everyday corporate policy.
Section 4. The architects of abstraction.
The source material argues that, far from being neutral arbiters of justice, the legal profession actively professionalized the evasion of accountability. The texts claim it was lawyers who engineered the complex corporate structures, the trusts, and the infinite layers of subsidiaries that shield assets from liability. According to this view, they are the true architects of the employment contract and the masterful designers of loopholes. They crafted a legal reality that makes the rules incredibly binding and punitive for workers, but incredibly flexible for capital. The text essentially describe them as mercenaries of abstraction.
Section 5. The ambition problem.
Okay, so this dynamic creates a huge structural contradiction. On one side, we have absentee owners who hold the legal property rights. They are totally distant and abstract. On the exact opposite side, we have the managers who actually run the machine day to day. The owner rules by right of property, but the manager rules by right of proximity. And the sources strongly suggest that this proximity to daily power, personnel, and operations breeds immense ambition.
Because managers possess this incredibly intimate knowledge and can often run the enterprise completely without shareholder input, the texts argue they inevitably begin to view themselves as the true operational sovereigns. They become pretenders to power. The analysis suggests this tension naturally leads to figures like the legendary Jack Welch at GE, or modern tech founders like Elon Musk, individuals who totally blur the line between administration and absolute ownership. They are self-managers who recast their managerial dominance as visionary entrepreneurship. The deep historical contradiction here is that the more power you give the manager to control operations, the more they actually threaten the owner's exclusivity.
Section 6. The corporate person made flesh. The source argues that the modern manager essentially embodies the corporate person in human form. The analysis states they exercise immense power without carrying personal moral accountability, acting as a vital shock absorber for the overall system. Think about it. When there are mass layoffs, unsafe conditions, or brutal quota enforcements, the theory is that the manager takes the immediate resentment from the workers while seamlessly deflecting the true blame away from the distant owners. By just claiming they are merely following directives, it allows the corporation to absorb all that blame without facing any real human consequences.
As we wrap up our look at these sources today, I want to leave you with a final thought, to maybe reevaluate your own daily grind. We've explored the theory that the modern manager actually inherited the tools of the overseer to act as the shock troops of capital, perfectly translating the desire for profit into the harsh reality of discipline. If we accept this premise, that your manager rules on behalf of an absentee emperor, who are you actually serving? Think about that the next time you log in for a performance review. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.